So let me get right into it. I wanted to thank my colleagues for hosting, and also Bob and Wendy and Terry for the idea. And we're just trying to work through this echo. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Great. Okay, perfect. And now we got the echo. So there's two things that I wanted to do tonight. The first is I wanted to answer just a human question that any one of us on the screen, every one of us on the screen would have, which is you wake up in the morning and you see horrific story and images from Ukraine. You see story of 2 million refugees. You see stories of mothers and young children literally dead on the street. You see pictures of thousands of people living under a subway. You see stories about war crimes and cluster bombs. And it's just so triggering and so horrible on its own, and it brings up such associations. And one question is, how are we to think about all that? And how do we engage that without being depressed? How do we engage the world as it is without being depressed? Is there some way to engage this story that is horrendous of the breaking of a country, of the creation of massive human suffering? Is there some way to engage that story in a human way, in a Jewish way, in a helpful way, without succumbing to depression? To be hopeful and strong and helpful and responsive to the real world. And how does that connect with the holidays coming up, Purim and Pesach after that? And then the second question is, how can our tradition help us both build community? We have a number of groups on the call tonight of TE Connects. These are groups of 8, 10, 12 people. And they are getting together once a month and they talk about all manner of things. Every group does a little bit different, but what they all have in common is friendship, connection, really good conversation, and they look forward to doing it again next month. And in a season where so many have felt so isolated and disconnected, how can we bring more people into these really healthy and holy and beautiful circles of friendship and continued learning? So those are the two things. I want to answer a human question, and I want to invite people who are not yet in one of these TE Connects groups to do so. So let's start with the human question. I want to begin with a great news story yesterday. It's hard to find a lot of hope in these stories, but I want to start with a news story that is going to be very evocative for many of us. And I want to ask you how you think about it, and then I'm going to put this in a biblical context and the context of other texts. So Caitlin, if you can please open up the news story from the Times last night. This is from the Times last night. Once victims in Southeast Europe, Jews come to aid fleeing Ukrainians. Chisinau, Moldova, which you're going to learn is actually Kishinev, like the Kishinev pogroms. At a synagogue in central Chisinau on Monday, an Israeli social worker, Omer Hod, had a flash of historical vertigo. Ms. Hod's ancestors had lived in Chisinau more than a century ago, surviving a devastating pogrom in 1903, before emigrating to what became Israel. Now their descendant has returned to the Moldovan capital, this time not as a victim, but as a rescuer. It's like closure for me, said Ms. Hod, a 26-year-old from Jerusalem, who had come to Chisinau to help with the evacuation to Israel of thousands of Jewish refugees from Ukraine. Back then, it was almost a shame to be Jewish, Ms. Hod said. Now, people want to show that they are Jewish so that they can be evacuated. Today, as in the early 1900s, Jews are once again escaping violence in Southeast Europe, but the context is radically different, cathartically so for the many Israelis who have come here to join the relief effort. A century ago, Jews fled widespread anti-Semitic attacks in cities like Chisinau and Odessa, pogroms that helped spur early Zionists to emigrate independently to Palestine. Today, the violence is not anti-Semitic. And this time around, representatives of the Jewish state, as well as an unusually high number of independent Israeli aid organizations, are now waiting at Ukraine's borders to shepherd Ukrainian Jews to Israel. The pogrom in Chisinau, also known as Kishinev, was a very central event that drove modern Zionism, the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said in a phone interview on Monday. In the same Kishinev, right now, we are saving Jews, Mr. Bennett added. The raison d'etre of Israel is to be a safe haven for every Jew in danger. We did not have it in 1903. We have it now. So Caitlin, if you can come back to full screen. So my first question to you is, how does that story of Kishinev, which is the scene of this horrific pogrom in 1903, 1904, that as a result of which many of our grandparents are in America. As a result of many of our grandparents, they went to pre-Israel Yishuv. And now it's in the news and Israelis are saving Jews again. First question, how does that make people feel? I would love to hear your voices about that. And if you want to talk, please put your desire to talk in the chat, and my friend Caitlin will let me know, and I'll be delighted to call on you. But Jews now going to Kishinev, not because they're fleeing a pogrom, but because they are saving others, mostly Jews, but also non-Jewish Ukrainians as well. How do you process that, and what do you think about that? Anyone want to add their voice? Anyone? Okay. Well, if you want to talk later about it, then feel free to. I want to, in the meantime, then kind of bring that connected to a biblical text. So, Caitlin, if you can turn to the first page that I gave you. This is from Deuteronomy. Okay. So the context for this is, those of you who were at Shabbat services heard Eliza's sermon about history and how history is filled with memories and what she called intergenerational trauma. And I can just tell you that at the evening minyan every night, when people talk about their loved ones' yorsites, since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot more concern and talk about the Holocaust and associations with the Holocaust. And she pointed out that that one of the reasons this whole thing is so emotional for Jews is the associations it triggers with the Shoah. And of course, for Ukrainians, it's the associations that it triggers with the suffering they had under Russia, particularly Stalin, the famine, etc. So I wanted to bring you a biblical, I think this is the biblical take on what you do with a traumatic history. And I think in a real way, it's going to connect up with this story about Kishinev that we started with. This is the biblical story. This is the Israelite farmer who comes to the temple in Jerusalem, and he recites the following. The Torah says that this farmer brings a basket of fruit and he lays it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. You, the farmer, shall then recite as follows before the Lord your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord our God, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. And if you look at the Hebrew, this makes it in a very graphic way. Vanitzak el Adonai. We cried out Vayishma Adonai et kolenu. God heard our cries. Vayar et onyenu. God saw our affliction. Ve'amalenu, our toil. Ve'lachatzenu, our oppression. Right? So that is, to use Elisa's language, that's intergenerational trauma. That is intergenerational trauma, right? And now this is a descendant of those Israelite slaves. What happens next? The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, awesome power, by signs and portents. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, O Lord, have given me. So the farmer recounts horrific history, 430 years of slavery, 430 years of oppression, harsh labor, etc. And the response is literally pomegranates, figs, dates, wheat, barley, first fruits. And then, Caitlin, can I just see one more page, the next page for a second? And then goes on, the end of the story is, you shall leave it before the Lord your God and bow low before the Lord your God. So you leave this basket of fruits for God. And then verse 11, and you shall enjoy together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst, all the bounty that the Lord your God has bestowed upon you and your household. In other words, and now we'll take the full screen, Caitlin, thank you. So this Israelite farmer has sponsors a kiddush, and then goes to some hotel, King David or wherever, Limbal or wherever, and has a festive meal full of enjoying the first fruits. So let's just step back, and then I want to hear your reaction to this on its own. The question we're trying to deal with is, what do we do with hard history? What do we do with the stories that we see now, and what do we do with the associations that they trigger in us? And the Torah's model is, you own the horrific history, you don't deny the horrific history, but somehow where it leads is not to bitterness, not to anger, but somehow miraculously to gratitude and generosity. My ancestors were slaves, but I'm free. Here's some fruit. Gratitude and generosity, and not bitterness. So my first question is, what do you think of the Torah's move here? I mean, do you like the Torah's move? Do you think the Torah here is wisdom, that we're going to try to not surrender to anger, not surrender to bitterness, but we're going to try very intentionally to lean into generosity and gratitude? What do you think about that move? Anyone want to? Sandy Thal, please.
So I think that they're connected. I think your first question, which I didn't formulate my answer to fast enough, I think that in response to your first question, I felt pride when I saw, people, Ukrainians being helped by people in kippot and Israeli garb at the border of Poland. And I think that generosity is what was talked about in that passage that you just read, that, we've been there, and now we have to show a generosity of spirit, and that means help in the way that you can. So I like it, and I think it fits together nicely.
Right. By the way, I mean, the context for this whole conversation, I think understandably, is Ukraine and the horrific headlines. But I just want to drop a note that Mitzrayim in the Seder and in Judaism is both a physical place, Egypt, but it's also a category of individual narrow straits. So, and I think that this model is even more accessible when we think about it personally. Like, something happens that's bad to us personally. We have a reversal. We have a health reversal. We have an economic reversal. We have a life circumstance reversal. Something doesn't go our way. And it could be very easy for that to eventuate in bitterness and anger and rancor. I mean, you know this, that there's this anger epidemic in our society. And to me, the reach of this portion, put aside Ukraine, but just in our own personal lives, how can we take our anger and upset and somehow convert it to gratitude and generosity? And that's somehow what this Israelite farmer is able to do. And to me, this is a helpful template in general, but also in the case of the story of the day, that's what the Israelis are doing in Kishinev, where there was a pogrom 100+ years ago. Other thoughts on this Israelite farmer and the current Israelis in Kishinev? Anyone? Please, Marcy.
Okay, my first thought,
Marcy Abramson.
my first thought when I heard, and I think I go along with what Sandy said too, is that when we are in angst, when we are in trouble, we feel the world's trouble, even if we're not there. And one way to control our anger and our feeling is to give of ourselves and to try to help others, to try to do whatever we can to put this anger and feeling that we can help. And when you help others, the Jews are coming together wherever we are. And by helping others, we're helping ourselves. And that's what I took from the first piece.
Yeah. Yeah. And I shared this before, but in Talmud class, but to me, it's such an evocative moment of a woman who reached out to me to say that none of the stuff that we were doing at the shul was helping her. The classes weren't landing and the services weren't landing and the songs weren't landing. And then I said to her, I was so sorry, trying to figure this out. Do you have any wisdom? What does land? What have you found outside the shul that is helpful? And she said that she heard that the JCC in Krakow was receiving a lot of refugees and they needed resources, and they were going to take in all of these refugees from Ukraine, but they needed help to provide food and clothing, etc. And so she started giving money to the JCC in Krakow so that it could help Ukrainians. And that was the first thing that landed and made her feel better. So action speaks louder than prayers, or speaks loudest when the prayers lead to that kind of action. Susan Schlesinger and then David Rosenson.
You're unmuted.
Okay, I think I use Susan as my nom de plume, if that's all right.
There you go.
I just
Alan,
wanted,
good to see you.
I wanted to sort of articulate the underlying issue that I think was highlighted by your correspondence. Many of us came 2 generations ago from what is now Ukraine. Our grandparents called it Russia. They said if they were from Odessa, they were from Russia. If they were from wherever. If you happen to know what shtetl you came from, you can look it up in Wikipedia, and you'll find that it was established in 1400 or 1500. And then every 100 years after that, the Jewish community was wiped out. Boom, boom, like clockwork. And then after the Russians killed all the Ukrainians in the famine, when the Germans came, the Ukrainians were on the whole pretty enthusiastic. And if you look at the records of Babi Yar right outside of Kiev, although the Germans did the shooting, the Ukrainians did the shepherding. So we have when I asked my grandfather, would he like to go back and visit Shepetovka sometime? He said, what are you, crazy? No. And so we have a mixed relationship with these folks, and no one likes to see cities getting blown up. That's awful wherever it happens. But I think that it's not crazy for us to have mixed feelings about these 2 groups of people shooting at each other.
Yeah. I hear that, Alan. And I guess my question back to you is, Do you feel that the human race has made progress since those dark days of pogroms? Do you think that, I mean, Steven Pinker, wrote this book in 2011, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he argues that violence is getting better and death from war is getting better, et cetera. It's a whole thick tome, that the human story is a story of progress as regards violence, death, war, et cetera. And do you feel that the Ukrainian Jewish experience, where those Khmelnytsky massacre and all those pogroms happened in Ukraine, and yet Zelensky is a Jew. I mean, their fearless leader is Jewish and proudly identified as Jewish. Do you feel that that's a story of progress, or what other way do you understand both parts of that story?
Well, I think
If
we
not
discussed
progress.
this recently, but you could, or you could believe that, or you could believe that the Amalekites are around the corner. Either way, but I think that your response is interesting. What do you do about it in this time? And I agree that you see the suffering and you go to help it, and you overcome the thoughts of where it comes from. But I think we have to do everything we can for the people who are suffering there. But in the back of my mind, we didn't leave Shepatovka because it was so good.
Right. No, I think that's a really important corrective, and is often noted that Ukraine was a killing field for Jews. I mean, now they have a Jewish president, but for all the pogroms and Cossacks, Ukrainian soil is bloodstained with Jews and Babi Yar and more than 1 million Jews during the Shoah. So yes, and here we are looking at Ukrainians today. It's very complicated, but the impulse is to help, and that's certainly what Israelis are doing and what so many of our members are doing in the face of all that complexity. David Rosenson, and then I wanna introduce a question to this august group. David Rosenson.
When I look at the words in the Torah that you quoted before, I see that there's this two-part message. The first is one of humility, that when we were slaves in Egypt, we could not liberate ourselves. We were not powerful enough. And God stepped in and did the job for us. He liberated us. And now we are enjoying the fruits of that liberation. And now we have the ability to try to emulate what God has done by helping others who are as helpless as we were back then. That we can bring ourselves closer to God by helping others in the same way that God helped us.
Thank you, David. Let me pivot from that point to an interesting fact. I don't know if you know this, and if you don't know this, then it was worth your time tonight to just learn this fact. Guess what single passage is the center, the skeleton, the spine, pick your noun, the infrastructure of the Haggadah. So, Caitlin, can you look on page 3 of the handout? After that, and then after, here we go. So keep going. That's it, and then go down a little more. So this is from the Hartman Haggadah, A Different Night. And you will see that the passage that we just looked at, my ancestor was a wandering Aramean, and if you can go down a little bit more there, Caitlin, just so that we can go all the way down. That entire story of his prayer, we cried to God, God heard us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now I've brought the first fruits of the soil, which you, God, gave me. The entire Maggid section of the Haggadah, from this point on, becomes an elaboration of this passage. So now, Caitlin, I'll take back the full screen. So in other words, of all the passages in the Torah, the heart of the Seder is not actually a passage from the book of Exodus. It's this passage of the Israelite farmer, which is, and if you study the Haggadah, you will see that the Haggadah is constantly expounding upon this Israelite farmer's prayer. And I think it is doing so to invite us to think about how do we pay this kindness forward. So now I want to ask an open-ended question. We are going to be finding ourselves at our Seder tables in a season where there are kind of three big buckets of issues. If we're trying to channel the Israelite farmer spirit, what are three buckets that we have? We got three different buckets, and I would love your thoughts for how you plan to engage these issues, if at all. One is the bucket of the residue of COVID and the residue of the pandemic. For most of us, we will be in person this year for the first time in 2 years. But you know that COVID has laid bare mental health crisis that is just so pervasive. I think of that verse in the Exodus story, the 10th plague, that there was not a house where there wasn't the slaying of the firstborn. I don't know of a house that has not been affected by mental illness, by anxiety, by depression during the season, and also loneliness and disconnection. And all of that doesn't go away just because we can walk around without our masks. So there's that issue. The second issue, of course, is kind of the brokenness of our country and inability of the different citizens in our country to work together peacefully and rationally to advance our common interest. We don't have that. And then, of course, the third thing is World War III. And that's just on every screen every day. And my question to you is, how do you engage this? So one possibility is you ignore it and you just read the Haggadah and you sing the songs and you do lovely skits with the young kids around the table. And that's fine. But if you want to talk about how to fix a broken world, there's no end of important things to talk about. So between those three buckets, the COVID residue, a broken country, and World War III, my question to you is, how do you think about your Seders, the first Seders in 2 years, as a space where you can engage these very substantial issues? Thoughts? And I think, Lisa Latant, your hand was up, and anyone else who would like to tackle that and add your voices, we would love to hear it. Lisa.
Thank you. Well, that threw me a little bit, your question right now, because after 2 years of not being with people, the idea of finally being with people at a Seder just brings me such joy that I think it'll be hard to balance the joy with what is going to happen to this world. So that's a really interesting question, especially since I don't have answers for any of them. I know what I wish, I know what I want, but I really don't know what to do to help bring unity in the country, to help a world that's in pain. I can start closer and help people who have been alone for all these years, for these couple of years. It's going to be a challenge. I mean, you still want joy at Pesach, but it has to have meaning and content as well. So I don't know.
Yeah, can we just double click on that, Lisa? I really appreciate your comment, because I think you expressed what I'm feeling, what I would imagine many people are feeling, which is there's a real asymmetry, there's a real dissonance. On the one hand, if you think about being at the same Seder table with the loved ones that you haven't been able to see in the last 2 years, that is just a source of joy. I mean, like you're back to life, you're back to family, you're back to children, you're back to grandchildren, you're back to siblings, you're back to friends, you're back to life. We don't have to use those horrible words, Zoom Seder. Zoom Seder. Again, Zoom Seder can be in the rearview mirror. That's happy, happy. But then when you actually get around to saying, wow, let's connect and let's talk about the world, then all the topics on the menu are kind of the antithesis of happy, happy, right? And the question is how to navigate that. So by the way, I don't have the answer, but I did want to share the question. And I also wanted to say, by the way, I think that the TE Connect groups, again, who have many different ways to have meaningful conversations, I feel like that's also a meaningful conversation. How do you think about in-person Seders, happy, happy, in a world that is the opposite of happy, happy? Steve Bookbinder.
Yeah, I think it's an important question you ask, Rabbi. I think it goes back to your point about gratitude and generosity. I think the three topics you brought up are really important subjects for the Seder. I think many of us can say that we are grateful that we got through this COVID. We're grateful for the leadership we had in people like Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky, and that we have survived this plague. And Dayenu. On the second point of polarization, I, like many others, have some relatives and old friends who I'm distant from, and I think that I have to have a sense of generosity with them. That's what the holiday means. And as for World War III, I think what, today last night we had a presentation from Carol Savitz about what the Joint Distribution Committee is doing, what Israelis are doing. And we have to focus on generosity and gratitude, just as you said, with awareness that we also sing V'hisha Amda, that in every generation there can be something. I think it is fascinating, and I'm not one of those people. My grandparents also came from, my grandfather used to say, I don't know what country I came from. They just all hated Jews, because he lived on the border between Poland and Ukraine and Moldova. He just didn't care. But 200,000 Jews have created a vibrant Jewish community in Ukraine. And for that, I am grateful. For that, I regret I haven't been there yet. So I think there are things you can say, and I think the three buckets you mentioned are going to be some things I talk about at my Seder.
Yeah. Steve, could you just say a word about, and I really appreciated Alan Schlesinger for naming it, because it's something that I've been thinking about. I mean, this season, particular, March and April, was a killing season and a killing land for Jews in the Ukraine, because Easter and Pesach was a time of blood libel and matzah filled with the blood of Christian children, and Ukrainian Cossacks would murder our ancestors in big numbers. Exactly in that land, just as you said, just as Alan Schlesinger said. That is to say, the ancestors of the people that we are now reading about getting crushed were crushing our ancestors. And it's not their fault, they're innocent. But I'm just trying to figure out, and of course, all of us are drawn to help them. But I appreciate this conversation for naming that complexity. Do you see this do you see it in terms of human progress? Do you see it in terms of not blaming one generation for the sins of a previous generation? What do you do with what your own grandfather told you about that area of the world?
By the way, I had a third grade assignment to talk about where my grandparents had come from, and he refused to discuss what country he came from. I think of it in terms of faith. To me, no one understands how we've survived 2,000 years, 16 million people, 20 million people now, 25 million. And I think of it in terms of the phrase Am Yisrael Chai. So I don't think of it in terms of, I think of it in terms of that wonder that we have survived, that there's a Jewish community in Odessa that's thriving, as it did when my wife's grandparents lived in Odessa and also left Odessa. So that's what sustains me. It's faith. And at the same time, I'm not naive. I know history. I know about Kishinev, and I won't forget Kishinev. But I have to go forward. I have to believe that, like the Aramean, we'll get to the other side.
Thank you, Steve.
Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you, thank you. Marty Paley, your hand is up next, and then, yes, Marty, please.
On Shabbos after the Talmud class. And the benefit, or the great thing about it, is it gives men the opportunity to talk about the Talmud class and also their feelings in a safe environment. And why I bring that up is because I was planning on the, before we have our Seder, on your suggestion many years ago, instead of what I used to do is everybody hurry up, sit down, open the page one, we're gonna go zip through this and we get through it. You said, how about having a discussion as a hors d'oeuvre and sort of discussion group? And I'm planning on doing that again, so we have people to be able to discuss their views on the three buckets. And I think that would be a very therapeutic and very helpful way to start the Seder.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you, thank you. By the way, and I think what's implicit in your comment, Marty, is it's very good to have discussions where there are no answers. Because I actually think on a lot of these questions, how to square the joy of an in-person Seder and the joy of seeing your loved ones again after 2 years with the opposite of joy in those three buckets, there's not really an answer to that, but at least naming it and having a conversation about it is at least responsive to the moment. Lynn Heller.
I want to put a different face on what we're talking about and share a personal story.
Please.
And understand Kiev and the Jewish community there. In 1983, my late husband, Zachary, was president of Masorti Olami, the international arm of the conservative movement. And he went to Kiev to start to organize the Jewish community there. And he was teaching there, etc. And his guide, Anna, said to him Friday morning, Rabbi, I want to take you to Babi Yar. And she took him, and they were standing. Babi Yar, the original is this massive structure with many steps and a large sculpture at the top. It was built by the Russians really as a tourist draw. And as they're standing there, Anna says to Zachary, do you see that couple up there on the top of the steps? And he said, yeah. She's, you know, they just got married and they're Jewish. He said, how do you know that? He said, because the couples get married civilly. The non-Jewish couples go to the tomb of the unknown soldier. The Jewish couples come to Babi Yar. She says, Rabbi, do you want to marry them? He says, well, look, I don't know if they're Jewish. I don't know, their parents were there, the grandparents were there. I don't know if they're Jewish. She says, wait here a minute. And she runs up the steps. She has an animated conversation with them. She comes back and she says, Rabbi, they are Jewish. They want to be married Jewishly. Their parents are Jewish. Will you do it? And he was with two other people from United Synagogue. They were the Eidim, and he performed a Jewish wedding ceremony on the steps of Babi Yar. And there has to be an element there of hope, of something of the, and by the way, the couple ultimately made Aliyah to Israel. They're living in Tel Aviv, and subsequently we visited them there. 20 years later to the day, Zachary had already passed away, but I was on a mission of leadership from Masorti Olami. We were in Kiev to attend the installation of the new rabbi in the synagogue in Kiev. He was born in Kiev, made Aliyah to Israel as a child, attended the Schechter Institute, the conservative rabbinical school in Jerusalem, and decided to go back to serve the community in Kiev. And so again, I'm standing there at the steps of Babi Yar, 20 years to the day, that Friday morning. And I knew we were going there, and I brought a jar, an empty jar with me. Please don't tell customs. I collected soil from the monument at Babi Yar, and the real site of the killing is a short walk away, and it's chilling. It's a ravine that's at least 30 feet deep. The perimeter of it has trees, and the roots of the trees protrude from the ground, seeming to want to capture you and entrap you. And that's where we said Kaddish. And I took soil from there and I brought it back here. And that following Friday morning, I first went to Minyan at Emmanuel. I felt the closeness of the community. And then I went to the cemetery and I buried the jar in front of Zachary's monument, sort of closing the circle. And I think what we have to understand, yes, there've been pain and all that, but we have to see that little ray of light, something to give us an element of hope that we can continue. And as I was standing at the graveside, I remembered the psalm that we say in the morning, Hafachta mispedi lemacholi. You have transformed my mourning into rejoicing. Are we going to rejoice at the Seder? I don't know, but at least hold on to some element of hope that there is a future, a next generation.
Lynn, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So beautiful. Thank you for your incredible story. And may Zach just smile down on a world that needs his spirit. Thank you. Paula Apsa.
Sheldon and I were in Ukraine this past summer looking for his mother's home. And we were at the Chabad and at the shul and with the rabbi, the Chabad rabbi who knows our families. And so I guess I feel very close to that family, to that country. I thought I heard you say during the Talmud class on Saturday morning, although forgive me if I'm misquoting you, that this is about Jews, but it isn't just about Jews. And I think of that a lot because I'm glued to the television. And when I saw that little boy walking, crying, the child, and when I see the orphans, 150 orphans going into Poland, being carried in men's arms, and all the families, the women and the children who left their husbands behind, I'm reminded all the time, this is about humanity. And I think we, I'm very Jewish minded and I'm always thinking about, is this good for the Jews? Is this not good for the Jews? But at this point, I think it's a little bit of an indulgence for us to be mad at people because their grandparents were horrible to us, as horrible as they were. The rabbi in Ukraine told us he's in charge of 40 mass graves. I mean, it's just terrible. On the other hand, these are young people and old people who are suffering. And in some ways, the Jews are a little bit luckier because they have a place to go, Eretz Israel. And so I just feel, and I hope Israel will take some Ukrainians who are not Jewish. I'm extremely proud of Zelensky. He is my epitome of resistance. And that's what I think about because I'm making a film about it. But at the same time, I just want myself to understand that this is about the Jewish people, but it's much more for that. And if, the old saying, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm not for myself alone, then what am I? Right. So that's what I think about.
Yeah, Paula, thank you. For no extra charge, I want to leave all of you disrupted with a serious question that I can't answer. I don't have the answer, but I feel this is a very important question. And maybe you guys can noodle on it and share with me your thoughts. But Paula, it comes from your question. Here's my question. What happens to our conversation around anti-Semitism now in the light of this war? Put it this way. Before the invasion, I would say the single most urgent issue at Temple Emmanuel, as I experienced it, I'm just speaking as I experienced it, was anti-Semitism. And I was hearing from so many people of all ages that they had never before felt such intense anti-Semitism. There was Pittsburgh just, 4 years ago. And then there was San Diego. And then there was New York, New Jersey. And then there was the Chabad rabbi who was stabbed 8 times a half a mile from Temple Emmanuel at the Shiloh House on the eve of July 4th because he was Jewish. And then Amnesty International report, which sees the sin of Israel being its very existence. And there was just so much energy. And then, of course, People Love Dead Jews by Dara Horn. And then, of course, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. And there was all this energy around anti-Semitism and how do we combat it? And my question is, what happens to all that energy now? Because Paula, I couldn't agree with you more. To me, I'm just speaking for myself, it feels parochial and tone deaf to talk about anti-Semitism now. When you got pictures of humans suffering and humans dying and 2 million Ukrainian refugees, how do we talk about anti-Semitism? This is not a Jewish moment. This is a human moment. And yet, the problem of anti-Semitism has not been solved. So I don't know what I can only tell you one thing. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong, and the other people on this thread have not responded. But before Ukraine, several weeks before the invasion, I was going to be on a panel with a bunch of other rabbis in Greater Boston and Mayor Fuller. And it was going to be about anti-Semitism. And I got an email this week from one of the participants saying, hey, we got to talk about what we're going to talk about with anti-Semitism. And I don't know if you've ever just written an email that just flowed out of you. It was like just, zoom, it just flowed. But my zoom was, I can't do this now. Tone deaf and parochial. This is a human moment, not a Jewish moment, even though I acknowledge at the same time, anti-Semitism has not been solved. So here's a question for your Seder tables. It's a good thing we have 2 of them. What happened to the anti-Semitism conversation now in the wake of this war? And if you have thoughts on that, I would love to hear them. Anyone want to tackle that for a minute? Anybody? Let's see. Susan Bergman. Sue.
Thanks. I think we can take an example from the Israeli people and Israel, who have responded to natural and unnatural disasters as first responders for the world, even offering to Iran after the earthquake several years ago, offering help. And I think that by that example, maybe, just maybe, there'll be more respect for Jews. I hope.
Yeah, Sue, by the way, thank you for that, Sue. There's an article in Sources, which is a very nice publication that Hartman puts out. It just came today. And there's an article about anti-Semitism, and its thesis is, and it was obviously written before the invasion, but its thesis is that the best way to combat anti-Semitism is not to talk about combating anti-Semitism, but it's doing justice in the world. I'm not subscribing to that thesis, but that kind of channels a little bit, Sue, of what you said. And I just put that out there for you to think about. Joan Katz.
Yeah, okay. I think when you said that, excuse me, one of the problems is the brokenness of our country. And I think the brokenness of our country allowed people to say things. We lost the civility, and a lot of things that people were able to couch. It was all out in the open. And I think what we're seeing with the response of the people in Ukraine and people in Europe, it seems that you don't hear about Le Pen right now. You don't hear about Le Pen in France. You don't hear about the Jewish guy that's also a very right-wing person in France. You just hear about Macron taking a lead and and it's just like in this country. I think that that kind of stuff is fading because you see there's a much bigger threat. And I think that some of that civility could come back. And that particularly that the article you sent about this 26-year-old Israeli that went to Ukraine, that kind of story has wheels to it. It's just going to go. And it's anyways, I think that's I feel that there's a little more hope, because we need hope. And one of the things that's endemic to Jewish people is always thinking when is the next shoe going to drop? Because that's that's who we are. We're always worrying. And it's part of who we have to cope, and we have to have hope.
Thank you, Joni. Thank you. And that story is a hope story, and maybe hope is what we do, is an action plan. Steve Thompson, we have 3 last speakers, and then we'll wind up. We have Steve Thompson, Louise Wolfe, and then our last speaker for the night is Bob Kahn. Steve Thompson.
Thank you, Wes. I think you've raised some absolutely provocative questions, and I think for the Seder table, and depending upon the mixture of ages and everything of the people present, some of these conversations might be, how they're handled might be rather ingenious. But one of the things that I just happened to notice, and I didn't realize it, but there was a picture of a statue of Khmelnytsky in Kiev. And, he's considered to be a hero because of the Ukraine-Polish war that took place in the middle of the 17th century. Unfortunately, and we know this, our own history, that 10,000 Jews were slaughtered by Khmelnytsky in the process of that. But there's also just recently, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but I just read it was either the New York Times or the Washington Post, that there was a small town in Ukraine just not recently in which Jews, they were Chabad, and they were trying to leave their small town, and they were attacked by Ukrainians. And I said to myself, wow, this is kind of like, it's almost like surreal. It's a juxtaposition. And you have a Jewish president who's like become almost like this world hero, and recognize that, and they emphasize this Jewishness all the time. And yet you have this small incident, and maybe it means something and maybe it doesn't mean anything. But I think one of the lessons is that we as Jews, we always tend to seem to forget because we get so comfortable until we're not. And it's kind of like we have to keep our with one eye open, but still be kind and still practice our Judaism the way that the Torah tries to teach us to do that. And it's not always easy. We have a lot of non-Jewish friends. The Jewish community and non-Jewish community. We have these interreligious affairs and events, and yet, always in the back of our mind, do we really trust it 100%? And it's not always a comfortable feeling, and yet we really try to be positive. So I think it's also something else that I just, I felt that was kind of like just in the middle of all of this and the tremendous suffering that the Ukrainians are going through, that they happen to have take these 2 pictures, and it was really troubling.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is kind of yes to every syllable that was said tonight. I mean, yes to empathy for the suffering, but Khmelnytsky just murdered masses of Jews, and the notion that there would be a statue erected in his honor, frankly, turns my stomach. So it's super complex. I mean, yes, Paula, you are 100% right. This is not a Jewish moment. We have to have empathy for the people who are suffering, but it is also true that there's this whole layer of complexity that is just also an ineluctable part of this very complicated picture. We have two last speakers, Louise Wolfe and then Bob Kahn, and then I will wrap up with a little thought. Louise Wolfe.
Okay, I would just urge people not to ever feel that if they're defending or addressing issues that are harming the Jewish community, that means they're being parochial, because the world has multiple problems and you can do more than one thing. And if we don't, there's never any reason to feel ashamed of asserting Jewish rights to justice along with everyone else. And so I think it would be really great to get the word parochial out of the conception of this thing, and that if we don't do that, who will be doing it? Certain problems don't go away because other problems exist. And I think we can attend to more than one thing in a suffering world. Thanks.
Louise, thank you. That gives me a lot to think about, Louise. Thank you for that. Thank you. Bob Kahn, you're our last speaker for tonight, and then I'll wrap up.
So I love the issues that you've presented for Seder discussion, and this last one is great. You know, the whole question of universal themes versus particulars in terms of advocating for Jewish people. And you know, I think we do have to be sensitive to timing. This, you know, the world's in a crisis right now, but you know, hopefully the crisis will be overcome in due course or in some period of time. And, you know, anti-Semitism will still be there. In fact, it could be complicated by this war. You know, I've heard, you know, we've heard Putin talk about denazification and kind of integrating Jewish issues into the whole situation. And, you know, at the end of the day, all the big issues are going to still be there when even as this crisis goes on, and we can't ignore them, whether it be anti-Semitism, social justice, climate change, discrimination, and a whole host of others. And so we have a full plate before us.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, thank you. So I want to end with a little creative tension that our sacred sources give us that I think draws a lot of this together. This coming Shabbat is Zachor, where we're supposed to remember what the Amalekites did to us. We read a Maftir Aliyah about remember the Amalekites. They hated on us. They went for the weakest and the most infirm. And it prepares us to think about Haman and his 10 sons and the arch enemies of the Jewish people. And it tells us that evil is real, that hatred is real, and that we have to plan and prepare and own and acknowledge and defend ourselves against it. Remember Amalek, it's the real deal. And yet, here's what's just so fabulous about Judaism. The Talmud has this notion that the grandsons of Haman, what happened to them? Because we know Haman dies, he's executed. We know his 10 sons are executed, but what about the children of those sons? What about Haman's grandchildren? So there's this tradition in the Talmud that the grandchildren of Haman converted to Judaism, moved to Israel, and studied Torah in Bnei Brak. And there is a similar tradition that Sisera, who is the arch enemy of the Jewish people in Judges chapter 4 and 5, the Song of Deborah, Sisera, that horrible judge, that he had a descendant, a child's child, who became Rabbi Akiva, who taught that V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, is the central principle. So what do you see when you zoom out of our sacred texts? You see, on the one hand, the admonition, the world is a brutal place, and there are people who mean us harm, Amalek, and we have to remember and prepare, and that's real. But don't therefore succumb to despair and think that all that exists is hatred. because there is at the same time this whole counter tradition of hope and redemption, that Haman's grandkids become yeshiva bachars at Bnei Brak, that Sisera, the Canaanite general's great-great-grandchild, is Rabbi Akiva, talking about love your neighbor as yourself as the central principle. And I think our task here is to hold on to a lot of complexity. And what a bracha, a blessing, that we'll be able to do it together in person. Please come to your loved one's Seder table in person. Please come back to Temple Emmanuel in person. This Shabbos, it's mask optional. As you saw in Michelle's letter, we're back. More and more people are coming. Please come back in person and feel the joy and connectivity of being in person here in the Rabbi Samuel Chill Sanctuary. And then if you're not in a TE Connect group, please come in person or Zoom, as every group does their own thing, but be with other people. There's so much to discuss. There is so much to unpack. There is so much substantial out there that needs to be examined and reckoned with, that we care about, that goes to our very life, our mission, our reason for being, that raises the deepest questions about us as Jews and as human beings. Isn't it a blessing to discuss that in a loving community? And that is what TE Connects is all about. So if you are in TE Connects, please keep going, don't stop. And if you're not in TE Connects, please send me an email or send an email to Terry Swartz Russell or Bob Kahn or Wendy Landon and get in a group, and let's discuss the endless complexity of our world together. Hope to see you in shul right here this coming Shabbat. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wes.
Erev Tov.